Good morning to one and all present here. It is indeed a great pleasure to have in our midst once again Dr. Lawrence Prabhakar Williams, who is no stranger to the Department of Political Science as well as the college. Dr. Prabhakar is a distinguished professor of international relations and strategic studies. He figures in the list of notable alumni of Madras Christian College and is well known for his erudite expositions, which on every occasion displays conceptual clarity, theoretical relevance, and analytical rigor. Is simply remarkable. I therefore deem it a privilege to invite our dear Professor Dr. Lawrence to address the gathering.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Christopher Chandran and my dear colleagues who have all come today for this second lecture. I thank the Lord God, our Lord Jesus Christ, and the Blessed Holy Spirit for this opportunity to speak on culture, commerce, and connectivity, the competing dynamics in the Indo-Pacific in terms of the dynamics of strategic access there. What is the Indo-Pacific and why is it important? If you take a map today and if you look into the eastern part of India, all the way from Malaysia or all the way from India itself, from all the way from India up to the west coast of the United States, this region is called as the Indo-Pacific there. The part of the Pacific Ocean that is from the international dateline towards what we could call as the Southeast Asian countries is called the Western Pacific. And the portion of the Pacific Ocean all the way from the international dateline to the west coast of the United States is called as the Eastern Pacific. So that is how it has been structured there when we look at from India there. What is the Indo-Pacific? The Indo-Pacific denotes the confluence or the coming together of the waters of the Indian Ocean region and the Pacific Ocean region there. The Indian Ocean region starts from the eastern coast of Africa. It traverses through India, Sri Lanka, which is essentially the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal. And then it extends into Southeast Asia there. Where the where the Indian Ocean leaves, the Pacific Ocean starts actually. So therefore, when we look into this political space, it is a very important space for three important reasons. Number one, the largest density of populations are all there in the Indo-Pacific region there. China, India are notably the largest population holding countries in the region there. This region is also known as the Asia Pacific because it deals about the continental portion of Asia. It aligns with the maritime portion of the Pacific Ocean actually. But the Indo-Pacific is being specifically used in the context of what is called in the age of globalization and the post-globalization, because that has now emerged as a vital maritime theater in which great powers are all playing the power play in this region there. What are these great powers doing in this region there? Each of these powers are trying to develop access into the region. They would like to have a presence in the region. There is a rivalry among all these powers, notably the United States, China, Russia, India, Japan, Australia, and Korea. These are some of the powers which are actually playing out the rivalry in the region. At the same time, these powers are also looking into competitive infrastructure buildup, and they're building up connectivity in the region. They're also looking into competitive strategic access in which naval, air, expeditionary, and amphibious forces are all being deployed here. Throughout this region, we find that all these countries are using island state territories to build naval and air bases actually. And therefore, there is an insatiable appetite among the great powers of the region, as well as the extra-regional great powers, to come into this region for two important purposes. One is maritime trade, the other is basically maritime security there. So these are two objectives why the great powers are playing into the region. When we look into the Asia Pacific is known to be having a continental geopolitical frame. But when we look into the Indo-Pacific, it has got a maritime geopolitics. and therefore the Indo-Pacific becomes very important. In the Cold War period, as well as in the post-Cold War, the globalization and the post-globalization phase, we find that all these great powers, the United States, China, Japan, India, Russia, and the European Union, they've all been coming into this place with a very substantive and symbolic presence in the region there. They have been leveraging the trade in the region there. And today, a number of territories are now under the control of what we could call the foreign bases in the region there. Diego Garcia, which is about 1,200 kilometers from the Indian coast, the southernmost tip of the Indian coast, with an American naval air base. Then again, we find Djibouti in the African coast, Reunion Island in the Indian Ocean region, Gwadar Port in Pakistan, Hambantota in Sri Lanka, Duqm in Oman, Chabar in Iran, Socotra in Yemen, Aden in Yemen, and Seychelles in the Indian Ocean region. These are all what we could call as maritime bases or naval bases of all these powers there. The competitive dynamics of the Indo-Pacific is something that is new, in which the civilization states about which we saw in the last week, they are assuming and aspiring to have their own powers there actually. If you take the civilization states of China and India, these two states are basically do not belong to the Westphalian narrative. And what these civilization states are trying to do today is to develop a new kind of regionalism that is called as new regionalism. This new regionalism is very popular in the region, and we find that China has taken an early lead since 2013 in promoting the Belt Road Initiative there. And quite some years down the line, India has also been promoting what is called the Project Mawsum and the Act East policy there. New regionalism is all about building infrastructure, expanding trade, and also trying to expand maritime connectivity. The new regionalism of Asia's civilization powers is reflected in the contemporary context. It is reflected in the economic, science, technological, and industrial expansion, and that is proving to be a lateral expansion of what we could call as China, India, Japan, and Korea, in which they are expanding their trans-regional economic, commercial, transport corridor connectivity. And their idea is to expand this connectivity for commerce and therefore trying to promote their culture. Therefore, new regionalism is a premise upon which the culture, commerce, and connectivity of Asia's civilization powers has been established. Having said that, let me outline the vistas of the great power dynamics in strategic axis and how does strategic culture, commerce, and connectivity play out here. If you look into the great power dynamics of the strategic axis in the region, we find that the Asia Pacific and the Indo-Pacific are two regions where this culture, commerce, and connectivity is being played out. And we find each of these great powers or extra-regional power, they are flaunting their cultural icon as a strategic symbol, and that is trying to provide them with their presence, and also it also paves way of investment in the region of building up their presence, posture, and pivoting to the state actually. When we look into culture and its manifestation are the evident sources of conduct of any particular state. They provide the identity manifestation, and therefore culture is also used to embellish what we could call the pursuit of core economic interests and strategic goals. Cultural icons and its impact on political, economic, social, commercial, and strategic dimensions defines the conduct of the state's foreign policy and the security policy. It influences public policy in the domestic era, and thereby it also feeds into the external era, into the external arena, wherein any particular state would try to project its power in the region. Therefore, great power strategies for strategic access and building is resulting in the building of regional pivots by which we find that all these powers have intentions to expand their commerce and connectivity in the region, whereby they would like to have a permanent presence in the region. Any great power which is projecting power and sustaining a footprint will always do it on the basis of historical and civilizational connect, actually. And therefore, we find that this civilizational cultural connect is something historical which goes through several decades and several centuries back. Strategic culture is essentially an attempt to integrate all the cultural factors, the cumulative historical memory, and their influences upon the state's foreign and security policies and their international relations. It is in this context, culture and strategic access of any power, whether it is a great power or an aspirational state, that comes out of an identity culture perspective. And this is what we call it as the constructivist approach in international relations theory. Strategic culture can also be elucidated from the social cultural identity lens, in which each state has a set of evaluative standards, norms and values, cognitive standards. They have their own rules and models which design and define how they operate in the international system. At the same time, culture and strategy is a very important component in articulating the grand strategy of a state, as what we saw in the previous lecture. And they also provide the operational details by which members of a strategic community in the state would try to build the cultural, commercial, and the connectivity dimensions of this particular project. What is the salience of the Indo-Pacific pivots and their dynamics in the region? Today, we find that the Indo-Pacific region is a maritime theater of ancient civilizations, and in the contemporary sense, they are globalized states. And therefore, they are able to bring about their cultures, ideas, transmission of historical memories of ancient voyages into new forms of trade, new forms of commerce, and new forms of connectivity there. There are three paradigms that the Indo-Pacific in its competitive pivots are witnessing in the 21st century. First, the Indian and Pacific Oceans are two vast maritime regional security complexes, and they have been experiencing several transformations in their security and economic dynamics there. And we find that these changes have come in the areas of the traditional and non-traditional security. In terms of economic growth, there has been considerable and commensurate regional economic integration that has come through globalization and new regionalism. And this globalization and new regionalism is having its complex interplay with the non-traditional and transnational challenges in the region. And these are actually proving to be conflictual in nature and scope. The second paradigm that comes into the competitive pivots of the Indo-Pacific is the rise of China. And that is coming in the debate of the apparent power shift from the United States to China. And in the recent times, we find that the current COVID crisis has actually resulted in a trust deficit that has come between the United States and China, and that has resulted in intense rivalry and competition between these two states. At the same time, the United States is also responding to the rise of China by a reinforced surge into the Pacific. And today, the US military forces into the Pacific are coming under a new policy called the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. The third paradigm of the competitive pivots of the Indo-Pacific is the escalatory potential of the conflicts in the West Asian Gulf region and the regional conflicts escalation in South Asia or Southern Asia and the Korean Peninsula. And these have accentuated external regional power intervention. At the same time, it is also leading to the consolidation of how extra-regional powers or great powers are trying to build up naval access and basing in the region. And they are also interested in exploiting the seabed resources and rare earths. And today, rare earths is a very important economy globally, and the Indo-Pacific has the largest concentration of sea-based rare earth materials. All these factors are now driving the control and monopoly in the great power dynamics of the Indo-Pacific. When we look into the Indo-Pacific in the age of globalization and post-globalization, it has actually been salient of a great power competition. At the same time, it is also laced by a maritime-based economic interdependence. We find that these matrices of post-globalization strategic axis power play is based upon the civilizational powers which rely on a cultural narrative of a nationalist or a hyper-nationalist idea. And therefore, this is actually competing and contesting with the neoliberal order of the global order actually. These are built on the following patterns. First and foremost, we find the countries in the region are building up strategic access and competitive infrastructure buildup. China commenced the Belt Road Initiative in 2013, and today, that has been followed by Japan and India. Today, China has various access strategies in Djibouti, and also we find that China has access strategies in Gwadar. It has access strategies in Maldives, in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh. At the same time, Japan and India have cooperated with regard to the South Asia, East Africa Growth Corridor. And India has also been promoting its Project Mawsum in the Indian Ocean region there. The United States had initiated in 2019 the Blue Dot Network under the Trump administration. And that has resulted in the renewed accents of engagement in the pivot to the Asia Pacific, to the pivot to the Indo-Pacific. Russia has been following to the pivot to the Pacific by developing new opportunities in opening the Northern Sea Route. The Northern Sea Route is essentially the Arctic Ocean region through which they are trying to increase the sea lanes of communication from South China Sea to East China Sea, the Western Pacific to the Arctic Ocean. Secondly, the United States has been promoting the Indo-Pacific pivot for quite some time. Their primary naval base is at Vigo Garcia, which also houses the conventional global prompt strike capabilities that the United States has, by which they can deliver intercontinental missile power through any part of the world within 24 hours. At the same time, they also have access facilities through visiting forces agreement in Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and Philippines. And recently, they have been able to expand their basing access in Yokosuka and other Japanese naval bases there. The United States has also been reinforcing its permanent facilities in Guam and Hawaii, and therefore they are sustaining their forward naval presence. The United States launched the Blue Dot Network as a grandiose infrastructure building network in response to China's Belt Road Initiative in November 2019 at the Indo-Pacific Business Forum in Thailand. The Blue Dot Network is a global initiative, high accents on transparency, sustainability, with high value of developmental impact. It is aimed at the rapid and robust investment of US dollars 94 billions in global projects and infrastructure. The United States' stake in the Blue Dot Network was to leverage its huge advantages in technology and the robust emphasis in transparency and accountability, having an inclusive scope to include all the countries strongly backed by Japan and Australia. The US Blue Dot Network has India as a strategic partner in this initiative, and that has been able to create and sustain, and it has been a way to push back the China's Belt Road Initiative there. The US Pacific Surge in the recent months, which is called the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, is the multi-strategic response to China, and also it supplements the Blue Dot Network. The Pacific Deterrence Initiative aims to provide for a naval air surge capability of the United States, carving out a Pacific sphere of influence within the Indo-Pacific, and it provides for a variety of deterrence and warfighting options in the regional theater. Thirdly, we find that Russia also has its own Indo-Pacific pivot. The Indo-Pacific pivot of Russia is a strategy of counterbalancing the United States and China, fortifying its Indo-Pacific pivot and enmeshing it with a robust regional role there. During the Ukraine crisis in 2014, Russia was entangled in the European theater, and therefore Vladimir Putin made an Asia-Pacific shift even as Russia was embroiled with Europe. That was a robust strategic flexibility to adapt and also to try to counterbalance the US and Western sanctions over the Russian interference in Ukraine. Moscow's approach in the region is been on the basis of its engagement with China, the two Koreas, Japan, and the United States as a Pacific power. Russia's fixation has been predominantly continental, which is the Asia-Pacific, and it is now developing the maritime dimension of the Indo-Pacific. So what are the objectives of the Indo-Pacific pivot of Russia? Russia aims at reinforcing a comprehensive strategic partnership with China, which is very pivotal for its core interests. At the same time, it has a critical element of maintaining balance with China and also with the United States and the other regional powers. Secondly, Russia has maximized its strategic flexibility and in strengthening its ties with Japan, India, and the two Koreas, Vietnam, and the ASEAN states in order to minimize the overt Chinese dependence. Thirdly, Russia has taken a pro-action lead in conflict resolution measures, the denuclearization in the Korean Peninsula, and broad-basing its diplomatic role in the economic engagement in Northeast Asia in the areas of comparative advantages in energy sector and military production and other exports. Fifthly, Russia has well balanced its diplomatic and economic engagement in various multilateral, multi-sectoral initiatives in the Asia-Pacific Economic Council, the East Asia Summit, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and its involvement in the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Fourthly, we will look into Japan's Indo-Pacific pivot. Japan's Indo-Pacific pivot is a typical of the civilizational state of Japan, in which it espouses a typical culture-commerce connectivity. This has been due to the Shinzo Abe administration elucidation of Freedom and Prosperity Initiative in 2007 by the Confluence of the Seas paradigm. This leads to the active elucidation of Japan's extended neighborhood engagement, and that has come in terms of how Tokyo perceives the relative decline of the United States and the apparent power shift that is now going towards China. Japan has been more assertive vis-a-vis the Belt Road Initiative. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's policy has been a vision of the free, open Indo-Pacific, and Tokyo outlined in 2016 an enhanced connectivity, free trade area, and infrastructure access across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. These are construed to be the foundational pillars of Japan's pivot to the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific. Therefore, when we look into the maritime operational dimensions of Japan's free open access of the Indo-Pacific, this is one of the most important responses to China's growing military and economic power in the region next to India. Tokyo has broad-based this initiative with a security dialogue known as the Quad, or the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, since 2017. And the Quad endeavors a robust strategic partnership between United States, Australia, India, and Japan, and consolidates Tokyo's link with US, India, and Australia through the form of new regionalism. Tokyo has adopted the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership and the newer version of its newer version to counter China's Belt Road Initiative and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership of China. Flanking on the west, we find that Japan established the South Asia-Africa Growth Corridor in 2016 in partnership with India. Fifthly, we will see India's Indo-Pacific pivot. India's Indo-Pacific pivot has been incremental, and it is growing with its Act East policy since 2014. And it has projects developed in Project MOSM and the South Asia East Africa Growth Corridor, which has been working with Japan. In a comprehensive scope, India aims to build an Indo-Pacific presence and a viable pivot through the rationale of assessing and comprehending China's rise and assertiveness. And we find that India's Indo-Pacific pivot expands India's role from the Look East to the Act East policy, and therefore it provides for an expanded scope for economic dialogue and security dialogue and engagement in the region. India at the same time looks into expanded maritime neighborhood in the Indian Ocean, and that India tries to secure the Indian Ocean through enhanced maritime domain awareness, expanded scope of naval operations, and new capabilities that India is building into the region. In its institutional scope, India looks into augmenting the robust framework of regional institutions like what we could call as the Milan exercises, the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, the IORA, and the other regional institutions of the Indian Ocean region. India's immediate strategic priorities are strategic management of its relations with China, and also to enhance the prospects of bilateral security with the United States, with Japan, with Australia. India's focus and priorities in the Indo-Pacific lies in the promotion of the bilateral trade and economics, fostering multilateral cooperation, and the prospect of accelerating naval acquisitions and building capacity. Sixthly, we will look into the Australian pivot to the Indo-Pacific, and that has been following in the close heels of the United States, Japan. Australia is a treaty partner of the United States in the Mutual Security Agreement, Australia, New Zealand, United States Treaty of 1951, which is called the ANZUS Treaty. Australia has been engaged with the United States since the Korean War, and also in the recent US-led global coalitions in Afghanistan and Iraq. Australia has been a focal point in the US rebalance to Asia Pacific in 2011, and the Port Darwin in Western Australia has been the US access point and the deployment of the US Marine Corps in the region. Australia is a key partner of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or the Quad, since 2017. Australia's pivot to the Indian Ocean, Indo-Pacific comes with a partnership to India, United States, and Japan in the Malabar exercises that happens in the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea, as well as in the Western Pacific. Since the US rebalance to the Asia Pacific began in 2011-2012, Australia has been responding to enhancing level of strategic ties and the importance of the Indo-Pacific in various bilateral and multilateral initiatives with the United States, Japan, and India. And therefore, we find that Australia plays a very pivotal role in the Indo-Pacific, which is a very vital counter to the Belt Road Initiative of what is called as of China, actually. Seventhly, we will look into the regional pivots and the domains of influence that has led to the promotion and what we could call the development of each power's Indo-Pacific mission vis-a-vis China's Belt Road Initiative. How has these regional pivots have been able to pursue the strategies is what we will look into. There has been a great power competitive race that has come ever since China has launched the Belt Road Initiative. And therefore, the Chinese have been accessing into Kiakapu in Myanmar, Hambantota in Sri Lanka, Gwadar in Pakistan, Chabar in Iran, Djibouti in East Africa, and other facilities in Maldives. This has resulted in the US, Japanese, Indian, and European responses to gain access for a competitive access in Djibouti, in the Andaman Nicobar Islands, the Changi Naval Support Facility in Singapore, the US Visiting Forces Agreement in Philippines, and in Guam and the Wake Island access that has come into that. What we see today is great power competitive access is now surging through the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean with the movement of US naval and air strike expeditionary forces coming into the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean region. Secondly, we find space-based constellations are coming into the region, whereby we find that the sea-shore space continuum has been built up. The GPS of the United States, the GLONASS of Russia, the BIDAO of China, and the Galileo of Europe are what we could call as space-based global positioning systems, which are now connecting to the maritime corridors of the Indo-Pacific. There are 7 transformative characteristics of these Indo-Pacific pivots, and we will look into each of these. The first one is what we could call the re-emergence of the Asian states as aspirational powers, and they are embellished by the civilizational, cultural, iconic imagery. The contemporary Asian maritime powers, which are now globalized, have a greater interdependence of economics and security. China, India, Japan, and South Korea are transitioning into the post-globalization civilization stage with a great degree of assertion to identify culture, and they are trying to use economic growth and strategic access to portray their influence in the Indo-Pacific. The Asian maritime powers of China, India, Japan, and South Korea, and Singapore are incrementally expanding their maritime naval footprint by adding technological capabilities in platform building and integrating operations at sea. The Asian maritime powers are now embarking on what the Western naval powers used to do, which is the operational maneuver from the sea. We find that the Asian maritime powers are all growing in terms of technological capabilities, joint doctrines, and they are now building up interoperable missions with the United States, European, and NATO navies. And this is triggering a revolution in military affairs, and we find that the Indo-Pacific powers are also rapidly developing their military capabilities. Thirdly, the dynamics of new economic regionalism is expanding in the Indo-Pacific region. We find that aspirational powers like China, India, Japan, and Korea are rapidly building up their economic power, science, technology, and industrial expansion, and that is increasing the comprehensive national power of these Asian civilization states there. This is leading to the transformation of the region into a growing economic and technological powerhouse. And therefore, what we find today is that the Indo-Pacific region is now turning out to be a highly industrialized, highly economically developed, diversified region. Fourthly, we find that the Indo-Pacific pivots reflect what is called the maritime complex interdependence. This maritime complex interdependence is a growing interdependence in terms of resources and markets between the literal Indo-Pacific powers and the extra-regional powers. This equation provides a framework in which trade of raw materials, resources, and markets basing off littoral-based special economic zones are all building into the region. The complex interdependence augurs for a competitive public diplomacy of investment, growth corridors, and pivot building in the Indo-Pacific region. Fifthly, the Indo-Pacific region and Indo-Pacific pivots are catalyzing a coalition building. And the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or the Quad, is one of the coalition building against China. And therefore, we find that this is being managed to build what we could call as comparative advantage over China in terms of economic gains as well as security cooperation. Comparative coalition building is a primary basis of the pivots, and it has been featuring military sales, military arms sales, forward basing of naval and air assets, cooperative naval and air exercises, defense diplomacy, and the fostering of interoperability in missions and platform deployments. Sixthly, the Indo-Pacific pivots are primarily focused on a very top-heavy slant of competitive dynamics of power play. And therefore, it is also inducing a new dimension which is called as the global commons approach. This creates what is called as a maritime global common stakeholdership in the Indo-Pacific oceans there. And that is impelled by the necessity of the convergence of the competing pivots to ensure survivability and sustenance of the maritime complex. That means even as the countries compete with one another, they are also cooperating towards establishing a benign maritime global commons order in the Indo-Pacific. Seventhly, the Indo-Pacific maritime pivots operating in the vast regional maritime security complex of the Indian and Pacific Ocean are looking into competitive public goods at sea. What is public goods at sea? Public goods at sea is basically a mission by which the naval forces of all the region, along with the coast guards, will try to provide what we could call cooperative access in the region for all those countries which are in distress. The United States leads in the public goods at sea initiative, followed by Japan, India, and Australia. Therefore, these are the important dimensions of the competitive dynamics of what we could call the Indo-Pacific. What are the interacting dynamics between the regional island states and the competitive pivots of the Indo-Pacific. The vast Indo-Pacific maritime theater also has an island geography in the entire region. The island states in the Indo-Pacific region are very important because they offer competitive powers the vital access and basing in the region there. Because the enormous amount of vital organic and inorganic resources is very important in the region there. In other words, in the contemporary context, this is called the blue economy of the Indo-Pacific there. The blue economy means the organic and inorganic resources that surround every country in terms of the maritime domain that each of these countries have. Therefore, every island state or territory is a hub of the blue economy infrastructure that is now growing in the region there. There are 7 catalytic transformational dynamics that are evident in the blue economy of the region there. Number 1, the island states in the Indian Ocean region, they offer a tremendous prospect of ocean resource exploration in terms of organic and inorganic resources. And the competing powers are vying with each other for access, and they endeavor for the prospect to locate and co-explore the potential in the region, both in the extended high seas as well as in the exclusive economic zones. Therefore, the future economic potential of the island states does not lie in the land economies, but in the blue economies. Therefore, the very prospective blue economy states of the Indian Ocean region, besides India, we find Sri Lanka, Maldives, Mauritius, and Seychelles. The prospect thus emerges for the competing powers to invest with generous capital assistance and technological inputs in exploiting the blue economy. Secondly, the island states are engaged in a constant diplomacy of securing and balancing 8 commitments, which is coming from the great powers, which are the competing pivots of the Indo-Pacific. And these patterns of assistance are very vital instruments in diplomacy, infrastructure development, and aid that is coming to the region there. And China's BRI has been one single dominant aid donating country that has come in the region, followed by Japan, the United States, and India. And the US-led Blue Dot Network is also trying to provide 8 commitments of high-quality infrastructure assistance to the island states. Thirdly, we find that island states are willing to lease strategic port infrastructure and maritime infrastructure. Therefore, ports in these island states are now turning out to be naval bases for the visiting forces agreement of a multinational coalition that is coming into the region. And what we find today is a development of maritime infrastructure in the island, in the port cities of Myanmar, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, and of course in Oman, and also in Djibouti. Fourthly, island states offer vital strategic access to the pre-positioned military hardware of these great powers which are operating there. And therefore, they do extract a greater amount of security guarantees from what we could call the great power states. Fifthly, island states in the future will have preferred military partnership, like what is called as the US non-NATO ally status that can be given to that. And therefore, we will find that great powers will hereinafter base their naval and air assets in the region. Sixthly, the island states in the Indo-Pacific maritime domain are now turning out to be the regional economic integration corridors by which we find that trade has been built in the region, and also we find that maritime connectivity, port infrastructure development is expanding in the region. Seventhly, island states are geographically positioned and they are straddling the littorals of the Indo-Pacific Ocean, and they're benefiting from the redefined United Nations law of the sea, wherein the maritime cartographic hydrographic surveys are opening extra areas of what is called the exclusive economic zone. Therefore, in conclusion, let me just try to highlight what these competing pivots of the Indo-Pacific have been promising in the region. Number one, they've been promising the prospect of greater commerce and connectivity by using culture as a dividend of expanding the strategic impact. Secondly, we find that competitive pivots are trying to assure regional stability, promoting global commons, and at the same time, they are also cooperating on a variety of non-traditional security issues. Since the Indo-Pacific is a very vast maritime domain, the nature of transnational threats and challenges are expanding, and therefore the competitive pivots are trying to address to build a rules-based order so that that will lead to a free, open, inclusive maritime Indo-Pacific. That's a third dimension. Fourthly, we find that the issue of maritime global regional maritime commons is actually soliciting an imperative of cooperative maritime security framework in the region. All these are the prospective as well as the enduring actions of the competitive pivots of the Indo-Pacific, because the Indo-Pacific is the largest maritime theater. Ensuring regional stability and ensuring good order at sea are vital two goals of the competing pivots of the Indo-Pacific. Let me end the lecture at this point, and I thank the department for hosting me in this lecture. Thank you. God bless.
Thank you very much, sir, for the wonderful and the extremely enriching lecture. The floor is now open to questions. I think the chat has been disabled, so you might have trouble asking questions through the chat. I request the participants to please unmute yourself if you have a question. And if you have trouble unmuting, you can raise your hand and I'll help you with it. Sir, I think I'll ask you the first question, if that's okay.
Okay.
Okay, sir. So the likely change in the U.S. regime, what impact do you think that could have on India-Iran relations with respect to the Chabahar port and the sanctions, likely use of the sanctions, sir?
Okay. First and foremost, there is no clear perception that the change of the U.S. administration will take place because the U.S. presidential election recount is going on. So therefore, the matter is sub judice there. But let me answer your hypothetical situation of what the Trump administration would do the second term, because the Trump administration would continue its hard stance policy against China, and also it would foster greater economic strategic dialogue with India there. And especially in the context of the 2+2 dialogue with India, we find that that reinforcement will be done there. With regard to Iran, I think the United States with the Trump administration would try to reinforce what we could call as the sanctions policy in trying to constrain the nuclear proliferation of Iran there. So that will be what will be done. A prospective Biden administration does not have any clue with regard to what it will do to China, because the Biden administration is viewed very weak on the China front because of the increasingly compromised stand of both Joe Biden personally, as well as what we could find in the case of the Democratic Party actually. So traditionally, Democratic parties have been anti-India and pro-China, and Republican administrations have been traditionally pro-India, and they have always taken a hardened stance towards China. So that is what we can expect in any possible transition. And therefore, since the dead heat is on the presidential elections, this is going to be only a hypothetical assessment.
Right, sir. Thank you, sir. Sir, I have in fact received a few questions. So can I read them out for you, sir?
Sure.
Okay, sir. This is from Asupal, 2nd ME. She says, is a Quad Plus narrative possible in the near future under the leadership of Biden by attracting island states?
Okay. A prospective Biden administration is not clear about the Quad. A prospective Biden administration will be something similar to the Clinton administration, where they will have greater cooperation with China and lesser cooperation towards the Quad. That's a problem with the Democratic administrations there. Not only that, we will find that the Democratic administrations have always been more in terms of sanctions process rather than actual economic cooperation there. And therefore, this will create a discord or a disconnect between what is now being established assumptions of power of the prospective Biden administration there. But having said that, a Trump administration in its continuity will basically reinforce the Quad. At the same time, it will foster greater strategic dialogue with Japan, India, and Australia.
Yes, thank you, sir. This question is from Bhavishya, second BA. She says, sir, while ASEAN has been phenomenal in uplifting maritime, in uplifting maritime commerce in the Indo-Pacific SAARC, SAARC has not been able to elevate intra and interregional trade as it was expected to do. What, according to you, is the reason for SAARC not being as successful as ASEAN?
Okay, that's a good question. SAARC has not been as successful as ASEAN primarily because the primary discord between India and Pakistan and SAARC has actually divided the agenda of SAARC between the two countries there. Whereas ASEAN basically goes by the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of each country. And there is a greater regional security community building of ASEAN. And ASEAN since 1967 has fostered for greater intra-regional cooperation and bloc cooperation with other countries. And therefore, we find that ASEAN is a very successful maritime trading bloc vis-a-vis SAARC.
Right, sir. Thank you. Participants, if you have any questions, I think you should be able to unmute yourself. Or you can even send the questions personally to me if that's what you would like.
Sir, I have a question.
Yes.
So how do you, China has been investing a lot in Sri Lanka, and even after recently also a lot of, we saw a lot of deals between them. How do you think this would affect the maritime, the maritime conflict? How do you think, what impact will this have for India and the others?
Okay. Well, I think what three things are coming out of Chinese investments that are made in the Belt Road Initiative, particularly the Maritime Silk Road. China's investment in Sri Lanka is actually creating more debt, and therefore we find that basically that Sri Lanka is entangled in the debt actually. And next to Pakistan, where I think the Chinese have put about $65 billion. Iran is also coming under a lot amount of debt, where about $40 billion have been put into the Chabhar port. And therefore, the China-Iran deal is actually exceeding more than 400 billions actually. So these are all expanding Chinese footprint, which are coming in three important states. One is Sri Lanka, first is Pakistan, second is Sri Lanka, and third is Iran. That means the sea routes in that particular region are being secured. Gwadar in Pakistan, Chabhar in what we could call as Iran, which will bring about the oil from the West Asian Persian Gulf for China. And the Hambantota port will basically aid China in terms of building a very credible infrastructure that will constitute a very important dimension of change. That will actually augment Chinese naval power. To counter that, we find that India and Japan have invested in the South Asia, East Africa Growth Corridor, which is actually a maritime security corridor that links East Africa with South Asia there. So this is a countervailing project that India and Japan have come. And the United States is also expanding the Blue Dot network in the regions, particularly with regard to what we could call as Sri Lanka, as well as in terms of the other states like Bangladesh. And also we find that in the ASEAN region is also seeing greater amount of US presence and investment coming in the region.
Sir, may I ask you another question?
Sure.
Do you think that there might be a revival of this BCIM, which India did not participate? because it promised a lot of connectivity through the K2K initiative that was done. How do you think that this fits into that new regionalism framework that you had been mentioning about? And moreover, the idea of new regionalisms, which has come about with the advent of BRI and OBOR, which is there. Do you think that India would once again engage in the BCIM initiative?
I think BCIM is successful on three parts. That is the Chinese, Myanmaris, and the Bangladesh part actually. So therefore, BCIM is not dead. Actually, it is a China, Myanmar, Bangladesh corridor which is now going on there. Now, India's refusal has come basically because of the kind of the overwhelming Chinese presence and investment that has come in BCIM. And therefore, India's shifted to the BIMSTEC, which basically encouraged more multi-sectoral technical cooperation there. If India has to come back to BCIM, that means the India-China relations will have to go into a great reset. And that reset will come primarily only when the territorial border configurations are being smoothed down, or been smoothed out actually there. Now, how that will happen depends upon the Indian administration's response to possible Chinese initiatives that will come in the days ahead of us there. So all that will depend again on India's initiative. But I think the Chinese are very much willing to go ahead with the BCIM because it is actually very advantageous for them more than for India actually there. India also is likely to gain from the BCIM basically in terms of commerce and connectivity, both in terms of the Northeast, but particularly with regard to Bangladesh and Myanmar. So we'll have to see how the Indian administration will respond in the days to come with regard to BCIM.
Sir, can I ask you a question? Sir?
Yes, Professor Hariharan.
Yeah. Thank you very much for yet another structured lecture. Okay, so I've been listening. Oh, I have 2 points for observation, sir. One, if you take long history of 400 to 500 years, since the beginning of 15th century, we always see oceans, ocean water, the blue water of the oceans have always been a contest. First, it was Atlantic Ocean. It was a problem between European states. And then the second shift came sometime in the 19th century. That is when the Nazi fascists and the Nazi powers came. And they were looking into, from Atlantic into, say, the Central Pacific Ocean on the western side, eastern side, and on the Atlantic Ocean. And then the third shift came in terms of the Western Pacific and Arctic and Antarctic Oceans. And now you see the shift is out into the Indian Ocean and the South Pacific. But if you take all the ocean trouble, so far, it is a 23 degree of Capricorn into the Cancer. We always call it as a warm water. It is not a cold water because we always see that nations can sustain with the type of predictability of the water conditions. And moreover, you can always see that it is the ocean conditions so conducive for any type of expedition, expansion, or anything. So we always call warm water outlets. And that is where Afghanistan became a center of a problem. The Central Asian countries have been a center of a problem. Turkey was a center of a problem. And Vietnam was a center of a problem. And now, what is that you see is that the same issue, but in Indian Ocean, without the presence of the superpowers, China is now trying to take advantage of this, which they have not explored it. Now, yes. This is why ASEAN was not able to stop this particular problem. Why this issue did not come under the agenda of ASEAN countries. This is the one major thing, one question. The second question, if you take ideology, it's like a communism as an ideology. Now, this particular communism as an ideology, you don't see only with Russia or with China. Today, we see with Vietnam. There was a problem between Vietnam and Cambodia at some time in Khmer Rouge region, and China was supporting Cambodia against Vietnam. Now, China and Vietnam coming together. We had a problem with Laos. Then we see this particular ideological problem with volatile ideological countries in Middle East countries. Now, these are all the countries that China is taking advantage of that. So China is trying to pump so much of money for infrastructure. It could be, even can be for a casino as well, right? And it could be for building up big malls, railway lines, transportations, and for buying and selling goods. And the cost of labor in China is also going up so much. What is your observations?
Okay. Thank you, Professor Harian, for these two very good questions. The first one is about the geopolitics of the oceans. And you are very right in mentioning the 23 degrees between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, wherein these particular changes have come. And particularly you have the equatorial region, which actually provides the countries a warm water access, and which is very conducive for various activities, including trade there. Now, one thing that we have to look into it is China has been expanding into the region, and why ASEAN is not responding to that. The main reason is because ASEAN itself is divided between a China camp and the US camp, actually. If you look into states like, the present divide is between Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, they're all, and also to a certain extent Indonesia, they're all tilting towards China. Whereas Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, Philippines are tilting towards what we could call as the United States there. So therefore, these states have been promoting a pro-China policy, and ASEAN is not able to manage that. The second reason why ASEAN could not resist the Chinese expansion is because when the economic crisis hit in 2008, we find that China provided, the earlier economic crisis in 1990, we find that China was very benign towards ASEAN there. That is the reason why we find that the China-ASEAN cooperation has increased from the first financial crisis in 1993 there. Subsequently, in the second financial crisis of 2008, we find that when countries ran out of money, which has been the real extent, China came forward with investment, attractive investment options, which the West could not match it actually. So therefore, we find that many of the countries in ASEAN are members of the Maritime Security Road. Indonesia is participating in the Maritime Security Road. China is also investing into Singapore for the Maritime Security Road. It is investing into Malaysia there. So which means the ASEAN is attracted by the Chinese diplomatic charm offensive of the BRI, and the economic investments of the MSR is actually making all these ASEAN countries tilt towards China there. So that is one of the main reasons why they are not able to deflect the Chinese ingress into the region there. When we come to the other states in South Asia, but in Southern Asia, particularly Bangladesh, Myanmar, and then if you take Sri Lanka, the quantum of Chinese investments since 2013 has piled up like anything there. For example, Sri Lanka has no way to go except for the Chinese investment, unless somebody is able to make a countervailing investment to what China has made into Sri Lanka there. Pakistan is written off thanks to a CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, with enormous amounts of investment that is going on. So what the United States and the Russia did with regard to great power rivalry of military expansion, China is trying to do it through the commercial expansion there. So winning power dividends through commerce is what China has been doing it there. The second aspect with regard to the various conflicts that have come in the region, we find that again, interestingly, that the Chinese are not entering into the conflict zones, but they're entering into the economic opportunities that the conflict zone are offering them actually. Whether if you could take in the case of Iran, we find that the Chinese are fishing into what you could call the troubled waters into Pakistan, whether we could take with regard to many of the African countries where Chinese investments have increased exponentially over a period of time. But there is one default that we have to keep in mind. And today, in the onset of the global economic slowdown, the Chinese economy itself is running slow. And therefore, we find that the Belt Road Initiative will not be able to honor its commitments, because that is leading to what is called as the debt trap of the client states towards China, and the debt trap of China itself in terms of the commitments. I think the Chinese have made something around they made about something about $4.1 trillion commitment into the BRI, which is a very huge amount of money. And if the BRI fails because of an economic crisis, I think China will be hit very, very badly in the whole consequence. Actually.
But I think so China has about $7 trillion of reserve with them. Next to US is the only country which has a huge reserve.
Yes.
And we cannot by any means we can match with China with just $1.3 trillion of reserve. That's
no,
true,
I think, but I think the Chinese are very careful players. Putting $4.1 trillion, even if they have a $7 trillion reserve, the Chinese will think twice. Particularly in the era of the COVID economies, I think the Chinese will be very careful in not expanding or over-expanding their presence there, actually. Because right now they have a military rivalry with the United States. So they'll have to look into all these factors and see how they could take forward this Belt Road Initiative. So one of the main objectives the Chinese will have is sustainability of the Belt Road Initiative. Because without sustainability, no project will succeed in international relations actually there. So therefore, the Chinese will be very careful in investing into that. And also we find that there are matching investments which are coming from Japan, investments which will come from India also. But of course, the Indian investment can never match the Chinese, but the US and the Japanese investment will be an equal match for what the Chinese will be doing into that there. Also, the Chinese are looking into, as what you rightly pointed out, increasing wage labor. The labor wages in China is another complicating factor for the Belt Road Initiative. In fact, the Belt Road Initiative itself was conceived and conceptualized so that the surplus dollars within China will be invested externally there. So they'll have to see how much they need for themselves. At the same time, they'll also need how much they'll be able to sustain the rivalry with the United States and other great powers there.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for very patiently responding to our questions. I also thank all the participants for participating in this session. I now request Shruti from 2nd BA to please deliver the vote of thanks.
A very good afternoon to one and all. First and foremost, I thank God Almighty for making today's event a grand success. On behalf of the Department of Political Science, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Lawrence Prabhakar Williams for this excellent session on culture, commerce, connectivity, the competing pivots of the Indian Pacific. Thank you, sir. That was a brilliant session. Lastly, I extend my gratitude to the members of the faculty and students of the Department of Political Science for their participation and cooperation in today's event and making it a success. Thank you all and have a great day ahead.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.